Gentlemen, please take your seats. I think that we are ready to start. First of all, on behalf of the Russian International Affairs Council, let me welcome everybody here, and I'm glad that we had such a turnout. I see representatives and leaders of some of the major think tanks located in Moscow, which suggests that there is interest for the discussion. And of course, I'd like to welcome specifically Daniel. You have a busy agenda here. Nevertheless, you found a slot of time to come to the Russian Council and to share some of your views and maybe to present your new book. And let me start with just a couple of introductory remarks. I don't want to keep your attention for too long, but let me just share my views as representative of one of the think tanks here, my views on the problems and challenges that we face. And of course, you know, I'm opinionated and I'm biased in my own way, like all of us, but I would like to bring to your attention a couple of trends in the developments of the Russian think tanks, but not only Russian think tanks. I think to some extent these trends are universal. And I don't want to attach any value to these trends. We can think that they are positive, we can think that they are negative, we can regard them as opportunities, but we can regard them as challenges as well. And of course, it is very hard to generalize, but I will still try to do that. First of all, I do recall when I was a young scholar, we had a kind of permanent discussion of what is more important. Is it country studies or general studies of international relations? What is more important in terms of generating particular proposals and suggestions? And on the one hand, the assumption was that you have to study a particular country, you should learn the language, you should get a sense of culture. But on the other hand, there was also a perception that if you dig too deep, probably you will not be in a position to come up with applied ideas and specific policy-related suggestions. I think that in this struggle, what we see today is a clear victory of generalists. I would say that the problem focus dominates over the area focus. At least that's how I see it. And the person can write about Syria today, tomorrow he or she can write about Ukraine, the day after tomorrow it will be China. So the research community goes with the fashion, goes with the flavor of the season. Is it good? Is it bad? But I think that there is a trend that we should keep in mind. The second trend, which is related to the first one, in my opinion, that in this competition between scholarly rigor, research, and enlightened journalism, the latter is winning, the former is losing. If you look at many think tanks, Russian think tanks, but also foreign think tanks, you'll see that some of them are becoming almost like journalistic syndicates. We have young, ambitious, very prolific writers who do not necessarily have academic degrees, who do not necessarily teach in universities, but they are very flexible, they are very articulate, they can present their views in a very captivative way. Again, is it good? Is it bad? But there is a trend. And definitely, I should say that we, the Russian International Affairs Council, is not immune to this trend, though we try to resist this temptation to the extent we can. I would also argue that we see a shift of the product, or rather a shift in the product. And fortunately or unfortunately, but people do not really read thick volumes. They don't have time, they don't have interest, and we definitely move into a clip culture society, including, partially at least, including the academic community. And definitely a policy brief, an op-ed piece, a short condensed report, preferably with infographics, some, charts, graphs, hopefully even with interactive, replaces academic monographs, or at least, gets the attention away from more academic stuff. Again, I don't want to qualify this trend, but I think that we will all agree that it's an important change. It sets different criteria of efficiency. It basically creates very different motivations. It gives us a different time frame. Sometimes, we cannot really allocate enough time to write a book or even an academic article, and we all know how difficult it is to get published in peer-reviewed journals. It might take months and months, if not years, and our market, if I might use this word, requires something that will be in demand tomorrow, today, yesterday even. So the field, the community, the sector responds to this change in demand and changes the way it presents its outputs. And I would add two more points, and then I will shut up. First, I think that it is also a clear move slightly away from the in-house capacity when you have more or less stable groups of scholars. I used to work at the Institute of USA and Canada Studies, and I remember how rigid the structure was here. We had departments. Departments were divided by sectors. Sometimes we had groups within sectors, but that was quite hierarchical. Right now, more and more what I see is an intention to go beyond in-house capacity, to engage scholars from other institutions, to cherry pick, if you wish. And the item of research is no longer a sector or department, but rather a project. Project-driven research. We get together, we put together a task force, we complete a project, and that's about it. There are some advantages in this approach, but apparently there are also some disadvantages, which we can definitely discuss. And finally, this is something which bothers me a lot personally. I think that there is a shift, and maybe you'll disagree with me, maybe I am dead wrong, but I think that there is a shift in many cases from mostly explanatory function of research to advocacy. Research papers are supposed to justify a certain position rather than to explain. It might be connected to the current international environment. We live in a rather challenging world. Of course, our research is politically loaded, though we might try to avoid that. But these are the challenges which I see. I think that, again, it's very good that we were able to get together here to discuss them. I don't want to prejudge any conclusions. I hope that we will have a very interesting and intellectually rewarding deliberation here. And let me give the floor to Daniel Drezner. I don't think that he needs any particular introduction, but definitely he is one of the top authorities in this field. Please, Daniel.
Спасибо большое, Andre, and I'm going to speak in English for the rest of this because you really don't want to hear me speak in Russian. Thank you very much to everyone for coming. In some ways, as Andre said, what I'm going to say now riffs off the book that I wrote in 2017 called The Ideas Industry. And I'm going to preface this by saying I'm primarily going to be talking about Western think tanks because I'm not, unlike a typical American, arrogant enough to assume that I know your sector better than you know your sector. So you can infer whether what I'm talking about applies to Russia as well as to the United States and the West more generally. But basically, to the extent that I talk about think tanks, one of the things I argue in the book is that there are two kinds of intellectuals. If we think of a marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of ideas is supposed to be able to take any sort of new policy idea, and presumably the purpose of think tanks and universities and other kinds of intellectuals is to stress test these ideas. The question is, if any new idea comes along, to what extent do we think that idea has some validity, that it actually should be considered seriously for policymakers and or for other actors? And essentially I argue there are two kinds of intellectual styles. And you can see these intellectual styles in a university, in a think tank, in the private sector, it doesn't matter. I call them public intellectuals and thought leaders. And if you're familiar with Isaiah Berlin's essay, The Hedgehog and the Fox, essentially public intellectuals are foxes. Public intellectuals know a little bit about many things. They have some area of expertise, but they're perfectly willing to talk about things beyond that. But the important thing about public intellectuals is that public intellectuals are critics. Public intellectuals excel at telling you everything that is wrong with everyone else's idea. They won't necessarily come up with their own, but they're very good at tearing down other ideas. Think of them like first-year graduate students. I think that's the best way to think about it. Thought leaders, on the other hand, are evangelists. Thought leaders are hedgehogs. They have one big idea. And thought leaders essentially believe that their one idea is so good that they can retrofit any policy solution or policy problem to their idea, and their idea will somehow solve it. I'm sure you all know these people, but none of you, of course, in the room are like that. Now, to be clear, the marketplace of ideas needs both of these kinds of thinkers. You need thought leaders to generate new ideas, and then you need public intellectuals to, in some ways, peer review them, whether in a scholarly setting or in a non-scholarly setting. And essentially what I argue in the book is that there has been three sort of secular trends in the United States, and I think in the West more generally, that have essentially stacked the deck in favor of thought leaders at the expense of public intellectuals. That if I was having this conversation, if I was giving this talk 50 years ago, I would talk about how public intellectuals are dominant. Now we're in a world in which thought leaders are dominant. And so there are advantages and disadvantages to both. In a world in which public intellectuals are dominant, the barriers to entry for new ideas is too high. Essentially, it's very difficult to get past gatekeepers. So as a result, the sort of supply of ideas becomes stagnant and ossified. On the other hand, a world in which there are many thought leaders and not enough public intellectuals, the barriers to exit are too high. It becomes possible for any thought leader to propose a new idea. There's lots of heterogeneous and new ideas. The problem is, and to be blunt about this, stupid ideas don't die. It is impossible to kill them because there aren't enough public intellectuals around to discredit the notion of these ideas don't work. So in the book I talk about these three trends that sort of stack the deck now in favor of thought leaders at the expense of public intellectuals. And you can determine for yourself whether these trends also apply to Russia. In the United States, one trend is the erosion of trust in institutions and in authority. In the United States, essentially, if you go from about 1965 to now, there's been a long-term steady decline in the trust, not just in the government, but in every major social institution in the country with the exception of the military. Whether we're talking about business or journalism or academia or medicine or you name it, there's been this increase in suspicion. And to be fair, some of it is entirely well-founded. There's been a series of scandals in what we would consider authoritative institutions, including knowledge-based institutions, on things like fake data in occasionally university research or the failure to replicate data. And these poses challenges for public intellectuals because public intellectuals tend to reside at the more traditional centers of learning. And because they've been discredited, it opens up the way for thought leaders to rise. The second, and this is probably more unique to the United States, is the rise of political polarization, which is to say in the United States, if you look at sort of the median preferences of Democrats and Republicans, all the data show the same thing. Democrats have moved somewhat to the left. Republicans have moved way, way, way to the right. And the problem now is that it's not just that Democrats and Republicans disagree, it's that they no longer trust each other. Indeed, there's been survey experiments and polling data that shows that, members that extreme partisans of, that are Republican or Democrat don't want their children to marry outside of their political persuasion. So in some ways, the problem is that ideology is a form of discrimination, in some ways more severe than race or gender or sexual orientation. The third trend is the rise of economic inequality. And this affects the marketplace of ideas, first because it's a problem that needs to be dealt with, but the more serious effect in the United States is the rise of plutocrats that have more money than they know what to do with, and it turns out that what they actually want to do is to go back to college. But they don't actually go back to college. What they do instead is go to Davos, or they go to Art Basel, or they go to Pop Tech, or they go to TED, or the Gaidar Forum even, potentially, or at least the St. Petersburg Conference, more likely. And these people also are genuinely interested in ideas, but what they wind up doing is funding their own intellectual salons. And there's a saying in the United States that the purpose of a public intellectual is to speak truth to power, and that's very difficult. If you think speaking truth to power is difficult, try speaking truth to money, because that's even more difficult. And it is here that we segue to think tanks. Because in some ways, the issue with respect to think tanks is that, at least in the United States, you can argue that they're experiencing an extreme problems with respect to funding. If we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we would be talking about the golden age of American think tanks, especially with respect to foreign policy, because essentially 9/11 was this sort of shock to the system where suddenly both the government and the sort of traditional foundations suddenly were interested in things like national security policy, the global war on terror, preserving the liberal international order, however you want to think about it. As a result, beginning in about 2005, you saw, at least in the United States, many think tanks suddenly building these very shiny new buildings, all along Mass Ave, if you ever come to the United States, whether we're talking about Brookings or the Institute for International Economics. And I can always guarantee you a good sign that you're in a bubble is when you suddenly see massive amounts of real estate investment. That's never a good sign. And so after 2008, what wound up happening was that a lot of the traditional sources of funding for these institutions suddenly started, they didn't disappear, but they began to slow down and trickle down. The government, which was a primary funder for a lot of this research, particularly the Defense Department, suddenly started ramping down. And more importantly, the foundations also almost dried up. In some ways, they had to for fiduciary reasons, because once 2008 hit, suddenly they simply lacked the interest to be able to pay, and they actually had to protect their principal. So suddenly these think tanks had massive amounts of overhead because they'd hired lots of communications staff, built these new buildings, enlarged their staff, and the question was, how are they going to fund it? And the issue here was they began to turn to newer sources of funding, and this is where they got in trouble. There have essentially been three new sources of funding that think tanks turned to, all of which were problematic. The first were foreign governments. So you suddenly had, at least in the United States, foreign governments that became interested in funding think tanks. In some cases, the money was not necessarily problematic. For example, the Norwegian government liked to fund certain think tanks, and they were explicit in terms of doing so, saying they thought it would curry influence or curry favor with the U.S. government. In other cases, the money was somewhat more problematic because there were accusations of conflicts of interest. So, for example, the Brookings Institution opened up a center in Doha because it was funded by the Qatari government, or Kazakhstan was also actually another large funder in some cases. And so there became claims or accusations that these think tanks were doing research that was compromised because of the sources of funding. Whereas the traditional sources like Carnegie or the Ford Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation generally were hands-off. The question was, were these governments, in terms of their funding, equally hands-off? In some cases they probably were, but in other instances the appearance of a conflict of interest was too much. The other sort of source of funding that think tanks could turn to was corporations. And here the accusations of conflict of interest became even harder to avoid, where you had members of the financial community suddenly funding think tanks. And they viewed it as, in some ways, a way to work around things like corporate lobbying, because by funding Brookings or by funding the Center for Strategic and International Studies, that was unregulated money, and they were perfectly happy to do that. And then finally, in some cases, they turned to extreme partisans. And this is how, for example, the Heritage Foundation funds itself. It's a member-driven organization. But as a result, it's also beholden to those members who prefer sort of very partisan, very conservative ideas. And this has led to, I think, two problems. The first is appearances of a conflict of interest, because it's been easy to sort of impeach the credibility of think tanks in some instances. But I think the other problem that think tanks have had, particularly more recently, is the question is, who is their audience? In some ways, the idea of think tanks has always been they were universities without students, and they were primarily interested in engaging governments and engaging policymakers. That when the original wave of think tanks first was created, both the Carnegie Endowment and Brookings back in 1916, the idea was that the government lacked technocrats, and therefore think tanks would actually act as a go-between between the academy and the state. The interesting thing now is that we live in sort of this age of populism, and the question becomes, how do think tanks influence the government? Do they do it by going behind closed doors and meeting with policymakers, or do they do it by a more public, campaign? And this goes to the point that Andre was raising, which is that they do it by being active on social media, by generating, viral videos, or, something that attracts attention. And I think in some ways there's some schizophrenia among think tanks about which strategy they should pursue, and it's unclear. And there's also this odd hypocrisy, because think tanks are nonprofit organizations, but as a result, they've become, at least in the United States, very vulnerable to accusations of these conflicts of interest because of where they've been accepting money from. The fascinating thing to me is that you've also seen a rise of competitors to think tanks, at least in the US, and that comes in the form of for-profit firms, whether we're talking about management consultants like McKinsey, or political risk firms like Eurasia Group, or in some cases the tech sector like Jigsaw, which is the Google or the Alphabet sort of in-house think tank. And the question is, how can think tanks compete with these for-profit institutions? And what's interesting is that the for-profit institutions have avoided the hypocrisy by saying absolutely they're definitely making a buck. They avoid the accusation of conflict of interest because they're at least upfront about it. And the other thing is, I think there's an inherent bias, at least in the West, that if you listen to McKinsey, that somehow what McKinsey says is thought to have more value than Brookings. And the reason is because McKinsey actually makes a profit. Ergo, their ideas somehow must have value. I would strenuously question that premise in a whole variety of dimensions, but nonetheless, it is a perception and it's a powerful one. So the question is, what can think tanks do in the future? I would suggest that there are three things that think tanks can do in this kind of environment, which is in some ways hostile to a world in which they used to exist, in which they could essentially function as public intellectuals. One possibility, and I think Robin Niblett talked about this in an article that came out in International Affairs, is to do what they've done before but do it better. To do it in a social media age where they're going to write the position paper, but they're also going to somehow find a way to make it accessible in a variety of ways, not just to policymakers but to a broader public. I have my doubts about that strategy, but I also don't think it's necessarily all that costly to try to pursue it. So I'm not necessarily opposed to it. I think there are two other things that think tanks can do that can play to their inherent strengths. One is they can act as conveners. In some ways, this very conference or this very panel suggests this. But one of the advantages that think tanks have is that they can often meet with actors that states cannot for whatever diplomatic reason. And so they can often get people into a room that would otherwise not be able to get into a room. And I do think there's some value added in that. And so they can in some ways act more as focal points for other actors to get together and then function as mediators for that, rather than necessarily generating their own policy analysis. But the second thing I think they can do is engage in rankings. One of the things that has become increasingly clear to me over the last 20 years is that countries are obsessed with status. They care where they are ranked in a whole variety of metrics. Whether we're talking about the World Economic Forum's ability to do business, the World Bank's cost of doing business index, McKinsey I believe has one on connectivity and so on and so forth. it is relatively easy to create a ranking methodology, and it generates a surprising amount of attention. And furthermore, a good think tank presumably would do this not in a cheap and easy way, but in a way that would actually reflect good scholarship and actually good methodology. And so I would be hopeful that that would be a way in which think tanks could potentially have, produce their policy product and nonetheless have it actually be relevant. And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Daniel, for your very thought-provocative and very rich presentation. I'm sure that it has already generated questions and comments, but let me give the floor to Ivan Timofeyev to lead our discussion.
Thank you very much, Andrei Vladimirovich. Thank you very much, Daniel. So now we are starting the discussion, and I would like to ask you to raise your hands, introduce yourself, and ask questions. The only thing which I would like to propose is not to follow our good Russian tradition to replace questions with long speeches. So if you have comments, please share.
That's an American tradition as well.
Well, we have much in common.
It's very comforting that it is universal.
Yeah, and I think that as far as we have Daniel Drezner here, I think we have a new commitment as RIAC, because following Daniel's example, we have published a new book on sanctions. So now we are committed to publish a new book on think tanks. Please, who would like? Radu, please.
Hello, I'm Anna Linders. I'm from MIMO. And I have a question. From your experience traveling to Russia and dealing with Russian scholars, do you find that the language in the academic communities is similar, and kind of the ideas and the curricula that students encounter are the same as in the United States?
It's a hard question to answer. Let me preface this by saying I don't know if I've had enough exposure in Russia to give you a definitive answer to that. That said, in my experience, I would say that in some ways within international relations, in terms of what I talk about, and in terms of universities, I would say that there are similarities. There's almost a time lag, though, in the sense of the institutions here, I find, are teaching some of the same things that we teach in the United States, but it's almost like they're teaching it from 20 years ago rather than now. And I know that I don't mean that to be patronizing. I think it's more almost a question of the degree to which the way scholarship diffuses, and that it might be that whereas in the United States, if I'm teaching something, I'm able to access the most recent journals and assign things relatively that come out relatively quickly. I think it's understandable that overseas you want to wait and see, well, what are the articles and what are the books that actually stand the test of time. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's an understandable precaution. Beyond that, I mean, the comparative advantage you can argue of it here is that you also have exposure to Russian scholarship in a way that I don't think exists in the United States, and that might be more unfortunate. You're starting to see some push within the United States to read, for lack of a way of putting it, non-Western IR. The question is whether there is determining the quality, and I think there's still debates about that. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. More questions? Любовь Yaroshenko, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I have the following question. Are there any difficulties of American think tanks working with the corporate sector, providing analytics for them? And if you discuss this question with the Russian colleagues, how does it differ with the Russian approach? Do the corporate sector in America go very often to American think tanks for analysis?
Yeah. Instead of McKinsey.
One of the things I talked about in the book is that, U.S. think tanks have been actually very upfront about this. If you, one of the surprising things to me is that if you go, I don't know if this exists now, but even 3 or 4 years ago, if you go to the websites of Brookings or the Center for New American Security or so on and so forth, they would talk about the corporate sponsorship programs they would allow. So this would be if a corporation gave them enough money, what they would get in return would be access to the think tank scholars, and indeed they would get access in some ways to, you know, if you gave them enough money, then the think tank would actually send experts to give a presentation to the corporation, in some ways providing them with analysis that presumably they would be seen as useful. And I do think to some extent corporations to some extent value the political analysis because, you know, it might be useful, but I think what they more value is by giving these think tanks money, the way that U.S. political money is regulated, donating to think tanks is easier for them and also less transparent than if they donate to, let's say, if they give to lobbyists or if they give to, you know, to members of Congress. Now, what I think has changed is that because of the scandals that, you know, you read about in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the think tanks themselves have actually decided they have to be more transparent about this. And I think you've seen U.S. think tanks respond in 2 ways. The first is, in some cases, they're still willing to take corporate money, but their argument is that they have a diverse arrangement, you know, diverse sources of funding, so therefore they're not beholden to corporate funding. And that can be persuasive. If the corporations are only donating 10 to 15% of your overall operating budget, that's a valid point. So the Council on Foreign Relations, I think, for example, can make this argument in the United States. In other cases, however, think tanks have basically had to decide that they're not taking money from corporations in order to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Now, with respect to whether or not this operates in Russia, this is where, again, I'm operating from a deficit of knowledge. But you know, my understanding would be that most Russian think tanks, as we understand them, are funded by elements of the government rather than. I mean, is there a tradition of corporate funding, or you know? Yeah, I would say I'm going to defer to you on this one.
You know, I think that we should be precise in this. For example, you take international relations. It's a capital sport, basically. It's monopoly of state. Therefore, it is difficult to find corporate funding unless some high-level state officials might encourage particular corporations to make a contribution to a particular think tank. And we know cases like that. We know these think tanks, we know these officials. And no. You're working with other governments, I assume, but but definitely, you know, I think that one of the problems here is that there is no market. If you take IR, if you take a large corporation, they have some in-house research in areas where they feel they need this research. And for them it is easier to have this in-house capacity rather than to approach a think tank. And the second problem with this funding, like with practically all funding of this kind, it's project-based. No, it is very difficult, if possible at all, to get core funding from a Russian corporation. Not to mention an endowment. We don't have this tradition, unfortunately. Maybe it will emerge, but I think if it is to emerge, it will probably be applied first to universities rather than think tanks, because universities, you know, are natural targets of endowments. And again, we know some positive examples in both the state sector, like GIMO and its endowment, but also in the private sector. Take the European University, which in certain ways can qualify the think tank as well. But I don't know any significant think tank in Russia which would claim you know, a substantial endowment coming from private or from public sources.
Sorry, I would add 2 things to that, which is, and this again might be where the United States is different. There's 2 things. The first is the existence of nonprofit foundations in the United States, of philanthropic foundations that can grant large amounts of money. In some ways, you can't talk about the rise of think tanks in the United States without also talking about the rise of Carnegie, Ford, and MacArthur as the sort of principal, and Russell Sage as sort of principal sources that started off with the initial endowments. The interesting thing now is that in some ways the sort of new generation of plutocrats, with the exception of Gates, and even there it's different, aren't setting up similar philanthropic foundations. In the case of Gates, for example, Bill Gates, he set up a foundation that doesn't really fund think tanks. It's more operations-based. The idea is that they will take action on themselves. And in other cases, there are foundations like Olin, for example, in which the foundation was designed from the outset to terminate. Because one of the things that happened is that a lot of these philanthropic foundations over time wound up developing missions that were at variance or at odds with what the original donor wanted, with whatever Carnegie or Russell Sage might have wanted. And so modern plutocrats are aware of this, and therefore they're designing gifts in such a way so that presumably the foundation dies down, it won't survive them. So in other words, they avoid the drift problem. And that's a challenge.
We call them sinking trusts in this country.
Yeah.
I would also add a couple of words. National traditions matter. In the US and partly in Great Britain, there is a deep tradition of private funding of NGOs, including think tanks. If you look at Germany, for instance, the GAP, our sister ship in Germany, is totally publicly funded. It's funded by the state. Indian Council of Foreign Affairs is funded by the state, and I can continue this list endlessly. So I would say that the tradition of private funding of think tanks is rather a minority practice, an exception. Well, not an exception, but not a major practice in comparison with public funding. So when we read the ironic statements that think tanks are gongos, governmentally organized, non-governmental organizations, we should treat this irony with irony. Alberto, for the first. Alexander, I see your face. I see your hand. Yeah.
Thank you. If you compare think tanks with media, I would say that media are much better protected than think tanks. There is special law in Russia, I believe in other countries, about media. The editorial policy is protected. They're protected, they don't need to reveal their sources. So journalist has some, not only obligations, but also rights. We can't say about this, about think tanks, the same. And there is, certainly, as you mentioned, and raised this question about number of accusations. I thought that it's only Russian phenomenon, but then we saw last year scandals with Brookings, with Center for National Interest, with some other think tanks. So my question is, do you see any way to protect think tanks from this kind of accusations and from this kind of and accusations are, the purpose is not to open some truths, but it's certainly to influence this situation. I think there are two tools. There is transparency of think tanks. So there is also kind of reputation, and we know it's from different experiences. If the think tank has its reputation, it's more difficult to just accuse it of something. But my question is the second part of the question. I think maybe it's possible to develop some kind of national or global code of conduct for think tanks. And if, for example, think tank subscribe for this code of conduct.
Compliance,
code of conduct with some standards. And if we subscribe for this, it means that we promise to others that we'll follow these standards. And maybe it could be some kind of also protection and quality mark for think tanks. As for example, for NGOs, there is quality mark of ECOSOS, Social Council or UN, the consultative status, so special commission which considers this. Maybe the same kind of code of conduct compliance with think tanks. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Albert.
So in response to the first half, I agree with you that in some ways think tanks are the most are feeling the pinch the hardest, because the other components of the ideas industry, with media being one, universities being another, the for-profit sector, all three of them, at least to some extent, have a market. You know, universities also teach students. They're not going away anytime soon. People still want to go to college. People still consume media. Corporations, by definition, presumably are making a profit. The question is always with think tanks, who's the customer base? And does the customer base pay anything? And the answer is they usually don't. So in some ways, the economic model becomes harder to sustain, even in a nonprofit sense. And so I would agree with you, that's a challenge. And again, the transparency, I think, is certainly one of the ways they can hedge against these kinds of conflicts of interest. In terms of a global code of conduct, I'm intrigued by that, but I have two questions. The first is that inevitably there are going to be questions about state funding in terms of a global code of conduct. So how do you, even in the, there are think tanks in the United States that also take money from government. So the question is, what would be determined ethically clean money and what would not? So presumably you would want to be able to take money, not just from states, by the way, but presumably even from corporations, possibly. Like, how will you determine this? And in some ways, to back up what Andre said, the US is simultaneously the most prolific producer of think tanks and also the most prolific outlier because of the way in which it's funded. So it raises issues about whether you could develop a global code of conduct that would be allowing, for lack of a better way of putting it, American exceptionalism, but also be consistent across other countries. The second and far more important question is who's doing these ratings? Who's monitoring the code of conduct? That would be an extremely contentious conversation, I would be willing to bet. And of course, then the question would be, well, would all think tanks agree to this? For example, you were talking about ECOSOC within the United Nations. To put it gently, I am extremely dubious that the Heritage Foundation in the United States would be delighted by the notion of ECOSOC regulating or monitoring what they do.
Alexander Bratersky, please.
Alexander Bratersky, I'm a journalist, but also writing a PhD work on think tanks. So my question would be on revolving door principle. Revolving door principle, sir. And how much big is that now, or is it getting less? I mean, less people are getting back to or from government to think tanks or they support corporations and so on. Thank you, sir.
I will defer to others in terms of the Russia case, but in terms of the United States, I think this is actually one of the few things that I think has become easier for think tanks. The revolving door is less, so the revolving door is the idea that you go to government, and then once you've left government, you go work in a think tank, and then once your party is back in power again, you go back to work for government. Interestingly enough, this has become less of a problem in the United States, I believe for two reasons. The first is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the Trump administration caused a logjam in the revolving door, which is when you had the Obama administration, you had a whole bunch of Republicans that were operating in think tanks, not just in Heritage or AEI, but also in Brookings, CSIS for some of the more nonpartisan think tanks, waiting for a Republican to be elected so they could then go in and serve. Trump was such an anomalous Republican, however, that most of these people didn't go into government. So they stayed stuck at the think tank, which also, by the way, made it very difficult for the Obama people who then left government to get a sinecure at a think tank, because think tanks only have so many, fellowships that they can offer. So that was problem one. Problem two, and this is interesting, and this is where you can argue Henry Kissinger is a pioneer, is that you are now seeing higher-ranking officials when they leave government not going into a think tank to make, to earn a salary. They're going into the corporate world, or they're setting up their own political risk consultancy. So, Kissinger was really the first to do this. He was a pioneer. But Zbigniew Brzezinski did it as well, and you saw former Bush people do it. I think, is it Tenio? I think is the Clinton one. You're seeing a proliferation of these kinds of things. So weirdly, now when if you've served at a high enough level, like a secretary or deputy secretary, you don't necessarily go to a think tank. You go to make money after that, which has its own revolving door problem. But that's different than the problems that affect the think tanks.
I can also mention that I recall in the early 1990s I was leading a department on the U.S. foreign policy at the Institute of USA and Canada Studies, and that was the only experience I had when a large group of think tankers were summoned to the foreign ministry. I dispatched maybe 5 or 6 people to the Russian foreign ministry, including people which Alexei probably remember, like Vyacheslav Chernov and Pyotr Litavrin and Nikolai Sokov and others. But I'm not sure that Teodor Paridze to Georgia and also Navruzov to Azerbaijan. So there was a very clear flow of people from the think tank industry to governments. But I'm afraid that it was a very unique situation, and I don't recall another case like that. And I think partially this relates to something that Daniel mentioned, because in the United States it happens when you have a change of power. When you have an opposition party come into power, bringing a number of its supporters from the intellectual community. On the other hand, of course, one of the ideas behind this institution was to make this concept of revolving doors working at least as a one-way street. And we are very proud that we have a number of former governmental officials, ambassadors, generals, who are closely associated with the Russian Council, and I think that they bring a very important dimension to what we are doing. So, at least in some way, this practice works in this country as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrei Kartunov spoke about this new nexus between enlightened journalism and think tanks and how this could evolve. And we actually have a very interesting example here in Russia. And I would like to ask Mediterranean to comment on that, because a while ago, Carnegie Moscow Center basically changed its approach to how does this think tanking. Right now, we can see that there are fewer long-form materials like traditional reports, but there are more short articles on current topics. Like my personal symbol of this era would be an article about Russian politics, Russian rap scene, and that was then translated into Foreign Policy magazine. So my question is, to what extent the model that we see now was something that you thought about, and how do you see it working, and how do you see it evolving in the future?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, the Carnegie Moscow Center is part of a global think tank, a pretty rare animal. We operate in 6 places around the world: Moscow, Washington, Beijing, Beirut, Brussels, New Delhi. So the things that you've been discussing so far, the past hour, are the stuff of our weekly meetings, or the management group, that brings together people from all over the world, and we discuss all these issues, and sometimes we come up with some creative thinking. But to respond to your question, life is a survival game. It also applies to think tanks. So Carnegie Moscow was founded in 1994, and by the end of the 1990s, there was a question: will it be allowed to continue in a very awkward relationship with a mother think tank in Washington, or not? So there was a very clear prospect of the Moscow Center being essentially phased out. Because the initial plan, 25 years ago, was that Carnegie will come to Russia, will establish a think tank, and then over time, the Russians will take it up, will start funding it, and it will be just a name. But essentially, it will be all Russian, in a democratic, Western-orientated, liberal, what have you, Russia, which never happened, which became clear by the end of the 1990s. So what to do? There was some creative thinking from Moscow that helped us survive. And instead of canceling the Moscow connection, Moscow was adopted as a model for other centers around the world. So we became part of a constellation, part of a global think tank. So that was what we did for our 10th anniversary. By the time we were getting close to the 20th anniversary, I started thinking about the future. We were rated the best think tank in this part of the world, and everyone was praising us. But I came to the conclusion that the more we stay the way we are, and the more we continue riding on the success that we had achieved, the closer we will be to the start of a decline. So again, in order to survive, you have to change. You either have to change the system, as we did in the first 10 years, or you have to change yourself, as we did in the second 10 years. So we had a very hard look at the agenda, which was initially set in the 1990s, an agenda that had very little relevance, or much less relevance, by the early 2010s. We looked at the way we communicate with people. Essentially, just to give you an example, we had a fine journal, a very successful journal, a very much sought after journal called Pro and Contra. It had 4,000 copies. It was read by maybe 15,000, 20,000 people. It was a must-read all over the country in the regional universities of Russia. It was a very good thing in the fine tradition of Russian thick journals. Now, we decided that it was time to kill it and start something totally new, something that would reach out to much wider audiences, something which would be online, not in a pro forma way, but a really interactive online thing that would have new stuff added every day. I offered that thought to the editor. She said she wouldn't do it. I basically said, in that case, I won't have you. I was later accused of being a Kremlin stooge to stifle an important liberal journal. But we killed the journal. Also, the money was running out. There was 18 months left before the end of the MacArthur Foundation grant that has supported the journal. And we either had to wait until the end time for money and say, well, it's not us, it's MacArthur that's changing, it's okay. Or we had to use the remainder of the grant to start something new. We started something new. And I think it's been very successful. It wouldn't have been successful had we not changed people. We changed everyone. Not only did we change people, except for myself. So I'm waiting. My head is on the block. I'll be the next one to go, or the last one to go. Essentially, the criterion was not to replace people of my age with people half my age, which was the result. The idea was to replace the people who wouldn't change, who would carry on with their gospels, and replace them with a new kind of people. The people with incisive minds, modern thinking people, globally thinking people, but also Russian people who had a stake in this country. Because we are a global think tank, but we are also a local think tank. We're an all-Russian think tank in Moscow. And we also had to make a trade-off between academic expertise and journalistic skills. And we thought that journalistic skills, on balance, are better for a think tank than academic expertise. So in other words, it's easier to turn a journalist into a serious thinker than to make an academic write in the style that would capture the audiences. This was hard. Everything is very hard. When I took over as director 10 years ago, we had 43 people on staff. We have less than 20 now. I fired more people than have remained at the center. It's all, it's not a cakewalk, anything of this. But you have to be very clear and you have to be very honest about what you do and why you do things. The audience, I think it's, there are two audiences. There's one essentially focused on policymakers. And policymakers would need a, why would a policymaker reach out for the stuff of the Carnegie Moscow Center? I think if you're talking about people in this country, you have a bunch of Russians who are as Russian as anyone else in this country, but who are essentially free to speak, to talk, to discuss things in a professional, serious, measured, and thoughtful manner. When you're a big boss, and you have, of course, you have, you know, we all know how the bureaucracy works. And in the bureaucracy, the first thing that the head of analytics would think of is what's the boss's opinion? What is it that the boss needs from me? Because if you give the boss an analytical piece that demolishes the boss's thinking, you may not survive the end of the day, right? But also, if you reach out for the stuff that your political opponent churns out, well, you'll find nothing other than abuse. It's totally useless. You reach out for the stuff that foreigners write about Russia. It's more often than not nonsensical. So this is, I think, this is the secret of our appeal to the policymaking community in Russia. The appeal to the policymaking community in the world is that we give the kind of expertise that is simply unique. You don't have another group of people who are inside the country who would have a clear and totally unvarnished view of their own country and the West. We have, I think we have license to say things that no one else enjoys, even within Carnegie, I think. And that does not only apply to Russia. It applies to many other things. It's phenomenal. It really is. But the real success is the Carnegie Roof thing, which reaches out to broad audience. Because think tanks change, but societies change as well. Policies of, I mean, when you have reached a certain age, you know that time actually changes a lot of people, a lot of things around the world, and you see that the people with whom, many of the people with whom you've started your career are no longer around. The people who were above you, they're all gone. Many of your own generation people are somewhere, you know. It's a new country. All countries are like that. So you need to look for new audiences and capture them. And we have the people who write the stuff that is the talk of the country, truly. Dozens of thousands and sometimes 100,000 of page views of the stuff that then we did something else. Much of what we produce, and this is perhaps our most closely held secret, most of what Carnegie produces in Russia under its brand does not come from Carnegie. Carnegie.ru publishes the stuff that is commissioned by Carnegie Moscow, but it comes from independent thinkers from all over. Russia, from all over the former Soviet space, from all over the world. And we are much bigger than what we seem. It doesn't matter how many, well, it doesn't matter how many people you have on staff, but you know, the intellectual capacity is not measured by the people who sit in your office. By the way, we have very few people who actually sit in the office anymore. So we have a lot of office space that we probably don't use. So I can go on and on and on, but I'm very conscious of the time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Ray of this Center. I would like to jump on what the trainer said and maybe send the same question to all of the speakers with a little specific focus. So it seems to me, and you've been talking about this with Dr. Korchnov as well, that in Russia think tanks are more and more core staff, which brings in people, expertise people when they need it. It's the same thing as Carnegie does, RIAC does, Valdai does, everybody does, and everybody in this room pretty much knows that if you need expert, you would bring it from somewhere. Where would you bring those experts from? Of course, because experts need salary to fund their activities and to pay the bills. So you can either bring them from academic institutions like Academy of Sciences or from universities. And again, Academy of Sciences is not the best paid prospect. So if you are a graduate from the university and you think that, I don't know, which career should I look for, you might think that, well, I don't have any job openings, I would just go to the corporate sector, I'll do management, I'll do whatever. And again, as you know, as Dr. Trenin said, the generation of people who were there, who were in Soviet academic institutions, who were in the 90s very active in their career and who are active now, they are getting older and older. And since there is no new people coming in, because it doesn't seem that there is too much of an opportunity here, how do you see the scene in 20 years, in 15 years? If there is nothing happening in bringing those people, and not even like bringing on people, but showing the people that someone needs them, apart from just asking them, hey, could you write us this, and then we'll talk to you in a year. Because, for example, Caspian Sea event, just an example, when this that was signed finally, very few people who did Caspian Sea became super popular, but that was in some way because there was a few of them. And it's the same with all of the expertise. So maybe you have some thoughts, not sure, not necessarily answers on this, any of the panelists or anybody in the room for that matter.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, if you want my reaction to that, I think that the reality is that think tanks will continue to skim milk in the sense that they are not major players who can sustain training and long-term career tracks. If you take most of think tanks, which we have here, you cannot really make a career through a think tank. We here at RIAC, it's a flat structure. We don't have positions that a person can gradually shift one from another. There is very small opening for any career there. But I think that if we look into the future, what can make think tanks important? Unlike you, I was deputy director of a large academic institute, and I had about 120 people, including almost 30 professors under my command. But of course, that created a certain institutional bias. I always preferred to get my people, not to go to IMMO, which in certain ways was a competitor, but to rely on the expert knowledge that we could get at home. And this is fine. But I think that what we can do in the think tank community, and I think this is a comparative advantage, this, I think it is, we can bring people from areas, sectors, and with different career tracks. You mentioned universities and academic institutions. But my experience suggests that on projects, you take Caspian Sea, you take any other project, it's important to get someone from the private sector, and they will offer you a very different perspective. Ideally, you should get a former diplomat. Again, it's an important perspective that we cannot miss. Sometimes I was surprised to see how knowledgeable were journalists, especially working in a particular country. It's a major asset. So I think that we cannot resolve the problem that you mentioned, but we can make our own contribution by somehow broadening the community of those who might make some sensible research and participate to projects. This is what we can do. Otherwise, of course, I think the problem that you mentioned is a problem primarily of the relations between the Academy of Sciences and universities. If we are moving in the direction of research universities, I think that the center of gravity should somehow move to places like the High School of Economics or Moscow State or MGIMO, and I think it is happening in a way. You mentioned Valdai, but it is very interesting. There is a kind of symbiotic relationship. You have Valdai, you have the department of Sergei Karaganov at the High School of Economics, you have SWOP, and you have Russia in global politics. It's a very powerful consortium, which of course...
And RIAC.
Well, RIAC. Yeah, it's a consortium which is very difficult to manage, because I can imagine that there are some, personal and institutional rivalries, red tape, whatever. But I think that there is something there, though the structure might look clumsy and ambiguous. But we don't have the luxury of being a part of a global network like the Moscow Carnegie Center has. So we have to, to build our own networks. And of course, to the extent possible, I understand that it might sound self-serving, but we should try to avoid competition, and we should emphasize cooperation, though, of course, competition is also important.
Daniel, would you like to comment on this question?
I'll just say two things very quickly. In some ways, if you want a more vibrant think tank, community where in fact someone could actually work at a think tank and actually carve out a professional experience, I can tell you from the U.S. experience, essentially what you would need, and here I'll risk being politically incorrect. You would need two things to be true. First, you need to have enough of a philanthropic sector such that they would be willing to fund these think tanks, because they're not going to, even if you went to corporations, you're not going to be able to get enough for like an endowment or an operating budget. And by the way, if you want to get that philanthropic sector, it also means the second thing, and this is even going to be trickier in Russia, you'd have to convince the philanthropic foundation that funding a think tank is useful because the think tank would influence policy. And that might be an even harder test here.
Yeah. Maxim Suchkov. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I'm Michael Reynolds from Princeton University. I have two questions. The first is for Andrei Kortunov. I was struck by the way that you contrasted the two different modes of analysis, one based in the country, regional focused analysis, and then another that's focused on problems. Because precisely the debate we're having at Princeton in the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, which run by Stephen Kotkin, which this audience here might know is the author of a phenomenal biography of Stalin. And so we're reviewing this question: how much sense does it make to keep regional focused programs, and maybe we should turn to a model that looks at as problem focused, as you discussed. You suggested that, or you stated, I think, that very decisively the problem focused mode of analysis has beaten out the regional focused one. And my question on that is why? Is that a case? Is it because it produced superior analysis, or because it was producing more appealing and more attractive analysis? By that I mean, one might expect the generalists are selected as generalists not because they have better knowledge, but because they're better communicators. And by better communicators, I mean not that they're better at conveying information more effectively or more accurately, but rather better at packaging it in a more appealing way. That is, beautiful writing, more people read beautiful writing than bad writing. So I'm curious as to, was the analysis better, or was the presentation better on the part of those people who are more problem-focused? My second question, and some of this has been touched on by the panelists, and this would be open to any of the panelists here, and that is, I've always thought of think tanks as a very American phenomenon, and I think historically, Dan would tell us if it's not the case, but so it's a very American phenomenon. And I was struck by, about 15 years ago, in Turkey, a country that I know very well. Right about that time, there was a real flowering of think tanks. And since that time, due to economic difficulties and then political difficulties, think tanks in Turkey have taken a number of hits. But at that point in Turkey, there was very much the idea the Americans do this, and we're going to consciously model ourselves on the Americans. An Israeli colleague of mine who worked together at a think tank then surprised me by telling me that in Israel, think tanks were marginal. And despite the fact one might think a small country like Israel, in a very difficult region, might want to maximize its ability to plan long-term, both economically in terms of national strategy, would be put a great deal of emphasis on think tanks. He said quite the opposite. They don't have them, and people don't give analysts there much credit. So the question is, I guess, how important are think tanks outside the U.S.? I don't know, is there a clear country, there's a clear number two where they play a role? And then are think tanks something that have been adopted outside by other countries because, well, the Americans do it, maybe we'll try it? Or are think tanks really an essential part of having a contemporary society? So I'd just be curious from any of the panelists who'd like to share their thoughts on that question.
You know, I can start, and again, you know, I might be wrong on that, but I think that there are a couple of reasons why generalists now beat area experts. First of all, if you deal with a particular country or particular region, there is a danger of getting into a methodological ghetto. You know, China is so special. Unless you use chopsticks and speaks Mandarin, you can never understand China. And the same applies to Russia, of course. You know, who can understand Russia? And Russia doesn't fit into social science mainstream. So I think that there is a danger, and this is one of the reasons why I see a certain decay. Because you invest a lot of time and effort in studying culture, language, history, and then turns out that social scientists do not recognize you as a peer. And your periodicals are not really credited as peer review. So I think this is one of the problems. Another problem is, it's an explanation of why this balance has shifted. The second thing is accessibility of information. You know, 20 years ago, we didn't have internet. And country experts, area studies experts were the custodians, the guardians of unique information. Right now, the value of information went down dramatically. Even language is not an obstacle. You can have maybe a clumsy translation, but nevertheless, you can have Google, Yandex, or whatever it is. So it is more democratic. The entry fee to get into the business is lower than it was, at least in my view. Let me cite what Dmitry has just said, and I think that his statement reflects some kind of conventional wisdom. He said that it is easier to turn a journalist into a scholar than to turn a scholar into a journalist. So the assumption is that the ability to write, sorry to say that, is superior to the ability to think. Again, I don't want to imply that, you know, people at Carnegie write but do not think. It's not true, definitely. These are brilliant people with a lot of potential, but I think that you know, it is partially, you know, it is a feature of the contemporary world. You know, the attention span of your reader is much shorter. You have to impress the reader. You have to be bright. You have to be brisk. you have to be very concise. Whether you pay a price, of course you pay a price, but it appears that the price so far is affordable.
I cannot simply allow this to go unanswered. Or
Well, but I didn't mean to be personal.
no, of course not, Andrea, of course not. But, you know, I've come to the conclusion that too often what is being written in 20 pages can be compressed to 2. And that would be the real value, maybe sometimes 2 paragraphs. So a lot of academic thinking, that's fine. Thinking is fine. I think you need a lot of thinking to write a tweet. That would be a serious statement on a given issue in a very time-sensitive environment. So it's not so much thinking, in my view, but the way you express yourself, the way you, at the end of the day, what is it that you're bringing to the table? One way to say, I'm bringing to the table a book, okay, which weighs half a kilo. That's fine. I wonder who would have the time to read it. But if someone takes the labor to, invests the labor in reading that, how much would he learn, or she? Can this be summarized in 2 pages, in 2 paragraphs? And I think that basically what the environment tells us to do is to compress the results of our thinking in a formula that really adds something to human knowledge, something that has never been there before you came up. The idea is not to produce books. The idea is not to produce articles. The idea is not to cover yourself with academic titles. The idea is to say something new and sensible. There are 2 things that a think tank should be doing, in my view. One is explaining things. We have a glut of information. We don't need more information. There's a lot of information around as it is. But there's very little explanation of what's going on. There are very few people who can say, well, I understand what's going on in the United States of America today, or what's happening in Russia. What happens, you know, in whatever country. So you have to be able to come up with an explanation that makes sense to most people. And the other thing is to come up with workable solutions or workable ideas, because often people in the government have little, in my view, generally have very little time for think tanks. And I think they look down on think tanks. If you're not privy to some very special, very classified information, well, you're nuts. I mean, you're not really there. But sometimes these very same people who have no time to think, but have every need for bright ideas. They don't have ideas. They would look around. They would ask questions. No, it's different in different cultures, and that's why I think, in response to your question, think tanks is well, it's an American invention. It's an American contribution to the world, right? One of many American contributions to the world. We don't have a word for think tank in Russian, as you know. And frankly, neither does any other language that I know. You go to Europe, we operate in Europe. Most of the think tanks are government-owned institutions that work for the government. One of the most important German think tanks is mostly working for the chancellor, and that part of the work is somehow classified, right? in other countries such as Britain and France, again, the most prestigious institutions are government-owned. Well, of course, governments do not give them all the money they need, so they have to reach out to the business. But it's essentially, so the culture in Europe is not very propitious for American-style think tanks. In China, again, you have the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and so many universities and so many other things, and they have a system, again, which is organized under the government of China, and that's fine. They're fine with that, all right? In India, it's a little bit different, but still, the Indian, again, I'm thinking more about foreign policy think tanks. India is only embarking on the role of a truly great power. And until very recently, India had as many diplomats around the world as Singapore. So it's a big and growing market. I don't know which way India will go. In the Middle East, again, most of the think tanks have been imported from think tanks that are, worth the name, have been imported from the West. So it's an American creation. I don't think that Russia will follow the American pattern. I don't think. I think we'll be closer to the European model. I think that most of the think tanks will be. And that's fine. I'm not suggesting that a government-owned think tank is somehow an inferior creature compared to an independent think tank. Not at all. It all depends on the quality of thinking, on the atmosphere of the think tank. Not just how it relates to the authority, but the way that a think tank operates within itself. If you treat people like colleagues, if you're all horizontal and you just have different duties, that's one thing. If you have a hierarchy, it's a totally different thing. So in Russia, unfortunately, we have a hierarchical structure, and that's bad. So that will have to change. But what doesn't have to change, which probably won't change, is the relationship to the government. I think that in this country, government, the state, will continue to be of overriding importance, also going forward. Whatever happens in Russia in the next decade or two decades or something.
Folks, we have we've got not much time. So what I propose is to gather the rest of the questions and ask our panelists to answer them all. But before that, let me exploit my status of moderator and put my finger in the pie of the previous discussion. What it seems to me that we need a sort of, at the current moment, regardless where we are, in a think tank or in a university or in a governmental structure, we need universal soldiers. And there is a significant deficit of universal soldiers. What do I mean? I mean people who can write serious academic texts with good methodology, coherent methodology, with an ability to state the problem, to narrow the focus and conduct research, or at least read books, serious books. We need people who can deal with mass audience, who can convert serious research into a simple language, the language which will be understood by people with clip society, and people who can make their knowledge actionable, translate their results into the, let's say, into the language which can be turned into a political decision. So when we have such universal soldiers, I think that neither universities nor think tanks will have problems with this stuff. But now we have. So, Nastya, you had a question.
From mentioned Harris School of Economics. Actually, I just want to support the idea that you said, and speaking particularly about young careers, I see that we often see a problem that for the person who just graduated from IR faculty, there is he or she sees lots of people who are experts. They meet them at the conferences, see on TV, read them on websites. But from the moment when the student is graduated to the status of expert, there is a black box. Students really has no understanding because everything changed. The whole career track changed. They don't know how to get from the status of freshly backed related to an expert, at least to a good expert. And I think that the point here is that yesterday's student has to admit that this way is not so easy, and from the moment that I just graduated to the moment I deal only with my favorite region, with my favorite problem, and I go to a fascinating conference to give a brilliant comment on that, there is also a part of pretty, not sometimes interesting, sometimes a bit boring work. You have to sometimes combine teaching and grading and reading something at night about your favorite region. And this fact is not so popularized among students that you have to be a universal soldier that Ivan just mentioned. You really have to work a lot.
Oh yeah.
And for yesterday students, sometimes this fact is not so obvious. And maybe that's our duty as a community to show off not only the most spectacular part of expert job, but also to show off some necessary but not so fancy part of it. That was short.
Thanks, Nasta. More questions? We have several minutes.
Yeah. Yes, actually, I'd like to address my question to Professor Daniel Drezner, considering the international aspect of US-based think tanks. In your book, you have mentioned the increasing role of plutocrats funding, such as Charles Koch, and also the evangelism and advocacy role of think tanks. And my question is, in light of these changes, what approach towards measuring the impact and influence of think tanks on foreign policy would you recommend to apply in political research?
And one more question here.
Right, I'm Sergei Vakulenko. I'm a corporate animal in the systemic group of scholars. My question is, if you think about it, think tanks are intermediaries. They are intermediaries between general public and scholars. They are intermediaries between benefactors and scholars. They act as curators. They lend their air of authority to scholars. They say, these are people who are worth of funding. These are people who are worth of reading. And by the way, we've published their works. In these days of disintermediation, do we really need a think tank? Well, Carnegie now acts as Amazon marketplace for independent researchers. You could say that as a mechanism for reputation, you could have likes, shares, what's not. You could have crowdfunding. You might have something like advertising revenue from ads on their web pages and so on. So in this world, wouldn't a think tank as an institution go the way of Sears department store?
Okay, one more question and we finish.
Okay, thank you. I have a very specific question for Russian speakers. As far as I know, in 2010, several important Russian think tanks were reorganized. For example, the LSMD and the Center for Strategic Studies, and also the Korchakov Foundation. And why in that year? Thank you.
Okay, so, floor is yours. Who would like to start? Yeah, Daniel, please.
Okay, so response to a couple of things. First, to Anastasia, I completely agree with your point. And actually, I would push back, Ivan, against your notion of universal soldiers. I think that's impossible. I think you have to accept that there should be a division of labor. And in some ways, this addresses your question about whether or not think tanks are going to be extinct. It is simply impossible for a single person, or it's very difficult for a single person to simultaneously produce top-notch academic scholarship and then, write the pithy op-ed or the correct tweet, or have their television show. Instead, I talk about this a little bit in the book. We operate in an economics of superstars, and it's possible to do that. But if you do that, you eventually wind up in a situation where you are asked to do so much that you will be bad at everything. And so I think to some extent, you actually do want think tanks because, first of all, not everyone can do everything. And second of all, even if everyone could do, or even if for those who can do it, they wind up inevitably creating their own scandals. Think about Neil Ferguson. Think about Fareed Zakaria, you know, in the United States. These are people who are top levels, and because they got overstretched, they wound up saying really dumb things. And so as a result, I do think that you actually need this division of labor, which, by the way, also to Anastasia's point about the fact that the work, that it's not easy to go from, you know, from graduating to becoming an expert. You know, in the United States, I like to joke when someone asks me about whether or not they want to get a PhD, I treat it as if they're trying to convert to Judaism. And the reason I use that metaphor is that when you try to convert to Judaism, we're not a proselytizing religion. We're supposed to say no 3 times before we eventually say yes. And you know, if someone wants to get a PhD, I give them many excellent reasons why they should not, because it's not an easy thing to do. And to quote one of my favorite movies, A League of Their Own, it's supposed to be hard. If it was easy, everyone could do it. You know, and so I completely embrace that notion. To the question of measuring impact in terms of think tanks, this allows me to go off on a rant, because the truth is, I think the attempts to try to measure it at this point have been god-awful. There's a very famous, or there's a think tank index that has been created by someone at University of Pennsylvania, James McGann. I don't think much of that index. I think it's, you know, it exists and is popular because there's nothing else out there. But basically, he's asking his friends what they think, and that's a really lousy way to create this index. So I actually do think there need to be more ambitious ways of measuring this. My concern about that, by the way, though, is that by doing that, you wind up focusing on quantitative metrics, which might be easy to measure, but actually don't capture what you're talking about with respect to influence. So as much as I want to see more systematic data, I'm also leery of that systematic data. And then one final point on the good writing thing that was brought up before, and I want to close with this. I think one of the reasons that academics have difficulty occasionally trying to write more accessibly is not because they're bad writers, but because they're trained as academics. And as an academic, you are trained within an inch of your life to hedge every argument you make. You are told, yes, I think X is true, given Y, Z, A, B, C, and there are all these other exceptions. That's why you write the 500-page book. So you can make the argument, but also make it point out the various times where it might not be true or the various examples where it might not work. You can't condense that into an op-ed. If you try to condense that into a shorter essay, you inevitably are presenting a caricature of your own argument. And while there are times where I do think that's appropriate, and I think you can do it, there are also risks and dangers. And I don't blame academics for occasionally being gun-shy about trying to go down that route.
Yeah, well, you know, there was a question about 2010, and indeed, in many ways, it was a turning point. It was about our institution and the Gorchakov Foundation, and it was also the time when Valdai started to change in a very significant way. I don't think that there was a decision, one decision covering everybody. I think that it was more of a coincidence in terms of our institution. For example, the legend is that then President Medvedev visited CFR and he decided that we should have something like that in Russia, and that launched the process of building this institution. But I think that definitely it was a time of great expectations. We shouldn't forget that 2010, it was the peak of reset. There were hopes. Unfortunately, you know, most of these hopes turned out to be illusions, but nevertheless, I think that there was a spirit and there was a vision that definitely made some things easier. And also, let me just make my final comment on the universal soldiers. I agree with Daniel that it is probably a very, maybe too ambitious a goal, but I think that even if the goal is not attainable, we should still have it in mind. And that should, I think, affect our approaches to education, to training, to, you know, in-service institutions. It's like, you know, in science, you should, you know, make scientists more knowledgeable about humanities and the other way around. It will make them more efficient. So I think, for example, at RIAC, what we have a system of fellowship I think primarily for masters, right?
And doctoral students.
Doctoral students, and we try to give them a sense of a different dimension, how they can combine their in-depth research with something more policy applied. So I would say that, like they used to say during the events of 1968 in France, soyez réaliste, demandez impossible. We should try to reach what is not reachable.
Two things. And I believe that one of the questions asked a few minutes ago and the question that Sergey asked just now are very much tied. When I was thinking about the answer to the first question, how I see the role of a think tank 10, 15 years from now, I would say they should be the managers of expertise and conveyors of that expertise to the audiences that need it and the audiences that the think tank targets. So I do not believe that the think tank should be big institutions that have lots of expertise within the walls, and thinking about them as being institutions with a very big reach in terms of expertise and in terms of the audiences. So that's how I see them. And you know, you have to be more of a manager than you normally, than just an expert scholar or thinker. And that leads me to the question about the department store. I think that I would disagree with that for one reason. A think tank, at least our think tank, has a mission. The mission is embedded in its title, which is Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Now that is the legitimation. That is what we're all about. And it's never been more relevant than it is today. Not even in 2010, for a very wrong reason, but it's more relevant. So I think that there are two things. There's a demand side. There are people who want to get something out of you or provided by you. And then there's a supply side. This is what we think you guys need to know. This is what we think you guys need to think about doing. So rather than a department store or an Amazon, I've been thinking about an analogy. So I would say it's something like Whole Foods. It's something like, you know, we have a mission that all people around the world eat good things and don't eat bad things. They need to have new eating habits, and they need to abandon their old eating habits. And well, this is an imperfect analogy, of course, but this is, I think it's closer, at least to my understanding of the role of a think tank, certainly like ours, than simply an Amazon that simply just conveys this piece of thinking, that piece of expertise to this or that audience. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for all of your questions and remarks, and special thanks to Anton Svetov and his effort who made this event possible. Thanks a lot.